Before we step into the quiet world of the Vestal Virgins, we need to take a slow walk back, way back, to early Rome. Not the Rome you see in movies with marble statues, fancy baths, and emperors yelling in togas. No, this Rome is younger, rougher, and honestly, a bit chaotic. More village with ambition than eternal city. Imagine a small cluster of wooden houses on hills, smoke drifting from simple hearths, and goats making more noise than the actual people. Life was basic. People woke up with the sun, worked until the sun left, and hoped very hard that nothing bad happened while they slept. Storms, raids, fires, sickness, all of it felt like it came straight from angry gods having a bad day. Now, the ancient Romans were super serious about their gods. If something strange happened, like lightning striking a tree or a weird cloud floating over the river, they didn't think, oh well, nature is nature. They thought, all right, which god did we annoy this time? Religion wasn't just part of their lives, it was their life insurance, emotional support system, and emergency hotline. Everything they did, from planting crops to going to war, needed the gods on their side. And right in the center of those beliefs was something simple, warm, and familiar: the fire. A fire was more than a tool. It was the heart of the home, keeping the family warm, giving light, and making food edible instead of, well, grass and sadness. To let your fire die out was considered bad luck. Some even thought it could invite trouble into the house. So keeping that flame alive became a kind of secret duty in every family. This idea didn't stay small. It grew, like Rome did. And soon, the city believed that its entire existence was tied to one special flame, a fire that must never go out. A fire watched over by the goddess Vesta, who represented the hearth, the home, and everything warm and safe. But before that tradition became official, Rome needed a bit of structure. And for that, we have to talk about Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. Think of him as the calm king, the quiet one after the founder, Romulus, who was, let's be honest, a bit dramatic. Romulus founded the city, fought wars, argued with his own brother, and eventually disappeared in a thunderstorm. No pressure, Numa. King Numa was different. He was peaceful, thoughtful, and believed that Rome didn't just need soldiers, it needed soul and rituals, and people who actually knew how to perform those rituals without accidentally upsetting something divine. So he reorganized the religious system, created priesthoods, and said, we need someone to watch over Vesta's sacred fire, someone calm, pure, and responsible. Basically, Rome needed the ultimate babysitters, but for a flame. And this is when the idea of the Vestal Virgins first appeared. But before we meet them, let's take a breath and look at the city around them. Rome wasn't yet the mighty empire stretching across continents. It was a small but growing community on the banks of the Tiber River. People still farmed, herded animals, and built their homes with whatever they could find. Life was simple, but the Romans believed that what happened in their daily lives depended heavily on the unseen world, the world of gods, spirits, and signs. Every sound, every accident, every lucky moment carried a meaning. If the bread fell while baking, maybe a god was unhappy. If a chicken walked into your house at breakfast, well, something was definitely up. So religion wasn't something you practiced once a week. It was a constant hum in the background, like a quiet soundtrack to life. Now, imagine all that fear, hope, and belief focusing on one glowing symbol, a flame burning inside a small, round temple, a flame that represented Rome's beating heart, a flame that absolutely, under no condition, should ever go out. Because if it did, the Romans believed the city would fall into danger, spiritually, physically, and politically. Drama? Yes. Effective? Also yes. So the question became, who should watch this flame? Who could be trusted not to walk away, get distracted, or forget to add wood during a windy night? Enter the Vestal Virgins. Before they officially existed, women in households were expected to tend the hearth. It made sense. Women managed the home, prepared meals, and kept the daily fire alive. Over time, this domestic role became spiritual. Eventually, Rome lifted this daily task to a holy level and said, "We need the best of the best, the purest of the pure, to guard our fire." So, the Vestals were chosen, not as warriors, not as politicians, but as guardians of Rome's spiritual safety. Their job would become one of the most respected and sometimes feared roles in the entire empire. But we're not there yet. At this point in our story, the idea of the Vestal Virgins is just beginning, quietly, slowly, like a warm ember that hasn't turned into a bright flame yet. Before the temple was grand, before the ceremonies were famous, and before the Vestals became symbols of Rome's stability, everything began with a simple thought. To protect Rome, we must protect the fire. The early Roman people believed deeply in this. They had seen enough danger in their young city to know that stability was precious. The sacred flame was a sign that the gods were watching, that the city was blessed, and that life would continue as it should. It's funny to think about now, but you could say the whole city had one giant case of anxiety. They were always worried something might upset the gods, so the flame became their comfort item, like a cosmic nightlight glowing at the center of the city. And someone needed to keep that nightlight on. This brings us to the beginning of the Vestal Order, a small group of young girls chosen not for beauty or wealth, but for a strange and mysterious destiny. Their lives would become quiet, sacred, and unlike any other women in Rome. Before we can fully understand the Vestal Virgins, we need to meet the goddess they served. And don't worry, this isn't the kind of meeting where you have to shake hands awkwardly or pretend you know what to say. Vesta was calm, quiet. Honestly, if gods had personalities based on vibes, Vesta would be the introvert friend who brings warm snacks to gatherings and leaves early. So, who was she? Vesta was the goddess of the hearth. That meant she represented warmth, home life, family, and the gentle fire that keeps everyone safe. Not the dramatic lightning bolts of Jupiter, not the ocean storms of Neptune, not the chaotic love stories of Venus. No, Vesta's world was simple. The flame in the home, the feeling of comfort, and the idea that a peaceful fire could protect a whole city. Picture the goddess as a soft glow, not a spotlight. She didn't even have many paintings or statues. Most gods had dramatic poses, muscles, weapons, wind blowing their hair like they were shooting a perfume commercial. But Vesta, she preferred a flame. Just a flame. No special effects. And the Romans loved her for that. In early Roman homes, the hearth was everything. Families cooked over it, warmed themselves by it, and gathered around it at the end of long days. It was like the ancient version of family TV time, except the show was literally just fire crackling. If the fire went out, the home felt empty and cold. So the goddess who protected that flame became the symbol of safety and stability. You could say Vesta was the original cozy aesthetic. Now, let's look at her temple, her humble but important home in Rome. The Temple of Vesta wasn't shaped like other temples. Most had big rectangles, tall columns, and doors that practically screamed, "Look at me, I'm important." But Vesta's temple was round, simple, no sharp corners. The round shape was meant to look like the earliest huts where Roman families once lived. It reminded people of where they came from. Inside that round temple was the eternal flame, the heart of the city. The flame was considered Vesta herself, not a symbol, literally her presence. As long as it burned, Rome was blessed. If it went out, well, people got nervous. Very nervous. Now, Vesta didn't act like the dramatic gods of mythology. There are no stories of her turning people into animals, throwing curses, or running off on wild adventures. She was steady, reliable, quiet. Honestly, she was the only god who probably didn't cause headaches for the priests. Because of her peaceful nature, the rituals in her honor were gentle too. No big parades, no loud trumpets, no dramatic sacrifices. Her ceremonies were slow, careful, and almost domestic, like sacred household chores. For example, during the festival of Vestalia, people would walk barefoot into the temple, carrying offerings of bread and flowers. It was a relaxed event, calm and respectful, like visiting a grandmother who tells you to take off your shoes before you come inside. All right, now let's talk about something important. Why would a whole city choose a goddess like this as one of their main protectors? The answer is simple. Rome knew that strength wasn't just soldiers and weapons. True strength was a stable home, warm families, safe nights, and a sense of belonging. The hearth stood for all that. The Romans believed that if the hearth of the city stayed sacred, the whole empire would stay strong. And Vesta was the spirit of that hearth. Her flame didn't just warm the temple, people believed it warmed Rome's destiny. Now, here's where the Vestal virgins step into the picture. Vesta didn't have a typical priesthood. She didn't want a bunch of older male priests waving incense around while trying to look important. She wanted peace, purity, consistency, and maybe less ego in the temple. So her priestesses had to reflect those qualities. They had to be calm, dedicated, and fully committed to caring for the flame. That meant no husbands, no families, no drama, just service. Because in Roman thinking, Vesta represented the perfect home, and a perfect home needed a perfect flame. But let's be honest for a moment. Taking care of a fire sounds simple, right? Add wood, don't let it go out, done. But the Romans didn't see it that way. They believed that the flame reacted to the mood of the city. If people fought, if leaders were corrupt, if war approached, anything could disturb the sacred fire. So tending it wasn't just a chore, it was a spiritual responsibility, one that required purity of mind and body. You could say the Vestals were the Rome's human fire alarm system. If something went wrong with the flame, people panicked. If the flame was bright and strong, people relaxed. They believed Vesta communicated through it. And Vesta wasn't just a goddess of flame, she was a protector of boundaries. She kept peace within families, guarded food stores, and symbolized unity. In a world where life could be unpredictable, she was the quiet force reminding everyone to breathe, stay calm, and stick together. Another interesting thing, Vesta didn't marry. She wasn't part of the drama-filled god relationships. She avoided the gossip, and that made her stand out. Her purity wasn't about perfection, it was about focus. She devoted herself fully to her purpose, protecting the hearth. The Vestals followed her example. They weren't just keeping a fire alive, they were keeping a whole tradition breathing. They mirrored the goddess they served. They lived in a home shaped like her temple, performed rituals in her honor, and walked through life with a sense of gentle responsibility. Even the Roman people treated her differently. When walking past Vesta's temple, many lowered their voices, as if entering a quiet library, not out of fear, but out of respect. They believed that disturbing her peace might disturb the peace of the whole city. In fact, Vesta's temple was one of the safest places in Rome. Important documents, treaties, and wills were stored there because everyone trusted her guardians. No thief would dare break in. Who would risk angering the gentle goddess of the hearth? That's like upsetting the warmest mom in mythology. So Rome grew up under Vesta's steady warmth. Her flame burned through wars, celebrations, earthquakes, and triumphs. It burned while emperors rose and fell. It burned while the city expanded across continents. For over 1,000 years, that flame stayed alive, a constant reminder that some things in life must stay steady. And at the center of that quiet, glowing world stood the goddess who never raised her voice, never started a fight, and never demanded glory. Just warmth, just calm, just home. That was Vesta. Before the Vestal virgins became the most respected women in ancient Rome, someone had to create the whole idea. And that someone was King Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, also known unofficially as the guy who finally brought some chill to the city. Let's set the mood. Rome's first king, Romulus, had left behind a city that was growing fast but acting like a toddler full of sugar. People were fighting, expanding territory, arguing, building, and basically doing everything except sitting down and thinking, maybe we should organize our religious life so the gods don't freak out. Enter Numa. If Romulus was fire, Numa was cool water, calm, steady, and thoughtful. He believed Rome didn't only need strength, it needed wisdom, rituals, and a sense of order. He probably looked at the wild city and thought, these people need soothing energy and some spiritual housekeeping. One of his biggest decisions was creating religious roles and priesthoods. He didn't do this because he wanted power. Numa wasn't that type. He did it because he truly believed the gods were watching and Rome had to show respect. And among all the priesthoods he organized, the one closest to his heart was the priesthood of Vesta. Numa understood something deep. A city wasn't held together by walls or weapons. It was held together by homes, families, and shared traditions. And at the center of every home was the hearth. So he thought, if the hearth keeps families safe, then a sacred hearth will keep Rome safe. This was the spark that created the Vestal Virgins. Now, let's imagine Numa planning this in his mind. He needed people who would protect the sacred flame day and night. Not part-time workers, not busy officials, and definitely not someone who would wander off because they forgot something at home. He needed dedication, purity, stability. So he chose young girls. To the modern mind, that seems surprising, but in ancient Roman thinking, young girls were seen as symbols of purity and focus. They weren't tied to family duties yet. They didn't belong to a husband, and they could devote themselves fully to the goddess. Numa officially created the order and laid down the rules. 6 priestesses would serve at a time. They would take vows, they would be honored by the city, and they would keep the sacred flame burning without fail. It wasn't a small job. It wasn't a casual hobby. This was Rome saying, here, take our spiritual survival. We trust you. Pretty intense for children, right? But Numa believed in them. He built the first house of the Vestals beside the temple of Vesta. Back then, it wasn't the large, beautiful home we imagine today. More like a simple, peaceful place, perfect for a group of young girls learning ancient rituals in quiet halls. Numa didn't stop at creating the job. He gave the Vestals privileges no other women in Rome had. They were freed from taxes. They could ride in special carriages. They were protected by law. If a Vestal walked through the streets, people moved aside respectfully, like she was carrying the whole city on her shoulders, which, in a way, she was. But with honor came responsibility. Numa set strict rules, not because he wanted to be harsh, but because he understood how seriously Romans took religion. The flame had to stay alive. The rituals had to be perfect. A single mistake could be seen as a bad sign from the gods, and Romans were dramatic about signs. A bird flying the wrong direction could ruin someone's day. Imagine what a sacred flame going out would do. So, under Numa's guidance, the Vestals became the guardians of Rome's heart. Now, here's something interesting. Numa didn't just create the order for practical reasons. There was philosophy behind it. He believed women had a special connection to the hearth. They brought warmth, comfort, and stability into the world. By choosing girls as priestesses, he wasn't limiting them. He was elevating their natural role to something sacred. Think about how unusual that was in ancient societies. Most religious power was held by men, but Numa chose to place this enormous responsibility into the hands of young girls. In a world run by warriors and senators, the quiet, gentle guardians of the flame became some of the most powerful people in the city. Now let's talk about how the Romans reacted. At first, the idea of giving spiritual power to girls might have raised a few eyebrows, but once people saw the dedication of the Vestals, respect grew quickly. They were like Rome's spiritual royalty. If a Vestal passed by, crowds quieted. If she prayed for someone, it was seen as a huge blessing. If she touched a condemned prisoner, the person could be pardoned on the spot. All of this began with Numa's vision. He also believed the Vestals helped keep peace. Rome had a habit of jumping into conflict. Numa wanted a symbol that reminded people of calmness and unity. The Vestals weren't warriors, but their presence alone kept the city grounded. They reminded Rome to breathe, to honor tradition, and to remember that strength without peace meant nothing. Over time, their order grew stronger. They developed rituals that only they knew. They learned ancient chants that were never written down. They handled sacred objects that no one else could touch. And through it all, the flame burned. It's easy to imagine Numa checking on them occasionally, nodding with approval as he saw the glow shining through the temple door. The creation of the Vestal Order didn't just give Rome religious structure, it shaped the city's identity. It said, "We protect our home. We honor the quiet forces that keep us together." And that message lasted for over 1,000 years. Long after Numa was gone, long after new emperors took over, long after wars shook the city, the flame he entrusted to a handful of young girls still burned. It became one of the oldest continuous traditions in Roman history. The quiet order he created outlived kings, generals, and entire dynasties. And it all began because one peaceful king believed that the heart of Rome needed guardians who understood warmth, patience, and devotion. The Vestals weren't just priestesses. They were Numa's greatest legacy. Becoming a Vestal virgin wasn't something you applied for like a normal job. There was no Temple Careers website, no neat little form asking, "Do you have experience caring for fire?" or "Can you resist starting chaos for 30 years?" Nope. The process was far more dramatic, spiritual, and honestly, a little nerve-wracking for the families involved. Let's start at the beginning. Every few years, the Romans had to choose a new Vestal to replace one who retired, or in rare cases, one who couldn't continue her duties. But they didn't pick adult women. They didn't even pick teenagers. They chose children. Little girls between the ages of 6 and 10. Why so young? Because the Romans wanted someone pure, untied to any household, and ready to be shaped into a life of discipline and ritual. A child didn't carry the weight of past responsibilities, and she could grow into the role with innocence, patience, and a fresh mind. Plus, a child was less likely to walk in with strong opinions like, "I don't like early mornings," or "Fire is not really my passion." So who picked them? The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, the religious boss, you could say. He had the authority to choose the next Vestal, and he took the role seriously. He would call together a group of eligible girls from noble families. The families didn't volunteer lightly. Becoming a Vestal was a huge honor, but it also meant their daughter would leave home for decades. Imagine the parents standing nervously as the Pontifex Maximus inspected each child. He wasn't judging beauty or charm. He wasn't looking for talent. He was checking for good health, a calm, steady nature, clear mind and speech, no physical defects, a family free from scandal. It sounds strict, but remember, Romans thought the goddess Vesta needed purity in every sense: family, body, soul, everything. Once the pontifex made his choice, the moment became official and deeply symbolic. The chosen girl suddenly held a destiny larger than anything her family could give her. She wasn't just becoming a priestess, she was becoming a protector of Rome itself. Now picture the chosen child. Maybe she's excited. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she's thinking, why is everyone staring at me like I just became queen of the universe? A lot of kids probably didn't fully understand what this meant. Some cried. Some stood proudly.
Some just blinked in shock. From the moment she was chosen, the girl no longer belonged to her family. She belonged to Vesta. This sounds harsh, but the Romans saw it differently. They believed she was being adopted by the goddess herself. That's how big this moment was. The next step was called the captio, literally the taking. The Pontifex Maximus would gently place his hand on the child and lead her away from her parents. It wasn't meant to be scary. It was a ceremonial gesture showing that she was being taken into sacred service. The family often watched with mixed emotions: pride, sadness, fear, honor, all swirling together. After all, they had just given their daughter to the most important religious role in the entire empire. But the rewards for the family were huge too. Their name gained instant respect. Their daughter would live a protected, honored life, and she would stand closer to the gods than almost anyone else in Rome. Now let's move to the actual ceremony. Once taken to the Temple of Vesta, the little girl underwent a ritual where she officially became a Vestal, kind of like signing the most important contract of her life, except instead of a pen, she had sacred rites and blessings. Her hair was cut for the first time in the sacred style. It wasn't a dramatic haircut, but it symbolized leaving her childhood behind. She also received her first white robes, simple and pure, showing her new role. Then came the vow, a promise lasting 30 years. 30 years. For a child, that's basically your entire life, plus a bonus childhood you don't get to use. The vow covered two major duties: guarding the sacred flame and remaining pure and devoted to the goddess. The second one wasn't about perfection. It was about focus. Her life now pointed in one direction like a compass that refused to get confused. The ceremony was peaceful, not loud or grand. No crowds cheering, no trumpets blasting. Just the priesthood, the flame, and the quiet presence of the goddess. The Romans believed silence honored Vesta more than noise ever could. After the ceremony, the new Vestal was escorted to the house of the Vestals, her new home. She wouldn't go back to her family, except for special occasions. This house wasn't like normal homes. It was a world of marble, courtyards, fountains, and calm hallways. A home designed for girls who lived outside the rules of everyday Rome. Imagine the little girl walking into that grand, serene building for the first time. Everything probably felt huge and mysterious. The older Vestals welcomed her, helping her adjust to her new life. They became her teachers, guardians, and role models. And what a life it would be. She wasn't the same as other Roman children anymore. She didn't have chores like cleaning or cooking. She didn't have to marry or raise a family. She wasn't judged by wealth or beauty. She was a chosen keeper of Rome's spiritual flame. In many ways, the Vestal virgins were the most independent women in Rome. But independence didn't come instantly for the new girl. First came training. 10 full years of it, learning rituals, ancient songs, sacred duties, and the meaning behind every gesture she made in the temple. Her childhood slowly shifted into something peaceful, disciplined, and spiritual. But let's be honest, she was still a kid, and kids get distracted. Kids forget things. Kids sometimes get overwhelmed. So the older Vestals guided her gently, teaching her patience and purpose. They passed down wisdom like mothers, sisters, and teachers all rolled into one. The selection of a Vestal was more than picking a child. It was choosing someone whose life would be woven into Rome's destiny. Her presence alone was considered a blessing. Her mistakes were taken seriously. Her successes were celebrated quietly but deeply. She wasn't just learning how to tend a flame. She was learning how to carry the hopes of a city. By the end of her selection and ceremony, the new Vestal had stepped into a role unlike any other in the ancient world. She became a symbol of purity, devotion, and the calm spirit of goddess Vesta. Her childhood ended, her sacred life began, and Rome believed it was safer because of her.
If you've ever wondered what it would feel like to live in a giant luxury home, but also kind of a workplace, but also a holy place where you can't make noise, can't leave, and can't bring friends over, then congratulations. You're about to step into the house of the Vestals. This wasn't just a regular Roman house. It was basically the most peaceful real estate in the entire city. No children shouting, no merchants yelling prices, no gladiators practicing their dramatic, "I'm totally going to win" speeches. Just quiet, calm, soft footsteps, and the gentle whisper of women who were not allowed to argue loudly or break anything. Let's take a slow, cozy walk through it. A mansion at the foot of power. The House of the Vestals was located right behind the Temple of Vesta, which was basically their office. Imagine rolling out of bed and being 1 minute away from work. It's convenient, but also means you can never pretend you're stuck in traffic. The house itself sat right in the Roman Forum, the absolute center of Rome. While the city around it roared with noise, the Vestals lived in a kind of sacred bubble. People walked by respectfully. No one heckled, no one tried to sell them olives, no one flirted. For Rome, this was shocking. The house was massive, 3 floors, dozens of rooms, long hallways, a giant courtyard, pools, statues. It was basically Rome's version of a quiet luxury hotel minus room service. A courtyard made for daydreaming. Let's start in the center, the courtyard. It had a long rectangular pond surrounded by marble walkways. There were tall columns and carefully trimmed plants that didn't dare grow out of shape. And of course, there stood 6 statues of former chief Vestals, because nothing says pressure to succeed like getting judged by marble ancestors every day. Imagine sitting there early in the morning, the sun warming the stones, the air cool, a pigeon or two waddling by like they own the place, and the sound of Rome in the distance, softened by the big walls. It was a perfect place for thinking, relaxing, or simply pretending to meditate while secretly taking a nap with your eyes open. The courtyard was the heart of their daily life. Calm, open, bright. A place to breathe. Something most Romans didn't get very often. Bedrooms that weren't exactly Pinterest-worthy. Each Vestal had her own room, which was already way more privacy than the average Roman woman ever got. The rooms weren't luxurious. Think simple beds, wooden chests, lamps, and maybe a curtain that didn't match anything. But compared to the cramped apartments outside, this was paradise. The walls were decorated with painted patterns, and the windows let in soft morning light. Nothing fancy, nothing chaotic, just quiet. And honestly, after spending all day tending a sacred flame that was absolutely not allowed to go out, a simple, quiet room probably felt like heaven. The bedrooms also had thick doors, a surprising luxury. Why? Because Rome was loud. And when you have a job that basically requires perfect focus, you need thick doors. And preferably no neighbors throwing parties at midnight, which was pretty common in the city. A kitchen, a bakery, and a whole lot of staff. Now, this might surprise you. The Vestals did not cook their own food. Yes, they were sacred, important, respected, and absolutely above burning their fingers on hot bread. They had cooks, bakers, and servants who lived in a separate part of the house. These staff members prepared meals, fetched water, cleaned, and handled chores. So the house, even though quiet, wasn't empty. There were footsteps, soft voices, and people moving like they were trying very hard not to disturb anything sacred. It was like everyone inside had the volume turned down to library mode. Meals were quiet too. Mostly breads, fruits, cheeses, olives, and sometimes nicer foods sent as gifts. Food offerings were common in Rome, and everyone loved giving stuff to the Vestals, hoping for a bit of divine good luck in return. Hallways echoing with calm.
The hallways of the House of the Vestals were long and open, lined with columns and arches. They connected all the important rooms: bedrooms, storerooms, meeting spaces, and little corners where a Vestal might stand to take a break from, well, eternal fire babysitting. Walking through these halls early in the morning must have felt magical. The sunlight reflecting on the marble, the air cool, sandals tapping lightly on the stone, and the soft smell of incense drifting from somewhere nearby. No shouting, no merchants, no animals, no drama. Just peace, which in ancient Rome was extremely rare. A meeting room for serious but calm decisions. Inside the house was a private meeting space where the chief Vestal and the others discussed rituals, schedules, and temple business. This was the Vestal's version of a boardroom, except no one yelled, no one slammed tables, and no one stormed out. It was a space for planning ceremonies, discussing temple issues, and reviewing which rituals needed special preparation. Everything was slow, deliberate, careful, which also helped keep everyone sleepy and calm, perfect for a bedtime documentary. Libraries and learning rooms. Since Vestals were some of the few Roman women allowed to be educated, the house had areas for reading, studying, and storing sacred documents. These rooms held scrolls of prayers, rituals, calendars, and old records. Picture a quiet room with shelves of scrolls, dim lamplight, and a Vestal practicing a ritual chant under her breath so she wouldn't mess it up later. The soft rustle of papyrus, the crackle of a small oil lamp, a peaceful atmosphere perfect for focusing, or accidentally dozing off mid-sentence. The secret passages? Almost. Now, there weren't actual secret tunnels like in adventure movies, but there were small back corridors and service paths used by staff and for moving materials quietly. They weren't magical or mysterious, just practical. But if you were a young Vestal wandering the house at night, they definitely felt spooky. You'd probably walk a little faster past them, just in case. A home that felt like a world of its own. Living in the House of the Vestals meant living in a protected bubble. Quiet rituals, peaceful meals, a courtyard that always looked clean, rooms that felt safe, servants who handled the chaos, a constant sense of calm routine. But it also meant rules, structure, watching a flame that could never go out, and knowing that the world outside, the noisy, messy, unpredictable city of Rome, was only a few steps away, yet completely off limits. It was peaceful, yes, but also very controlled. Calm, but not always free. Beautiful, but not exactly a place you could run around feeling wild and spontaneous. Still, compared to the rest of Rome, this house was like an island of soft silence floating in a loud ocean. And for a bedtime documentary, honestly, it's perfect.
At the heart of the Vestal's quiet world burned a fire unlike any other. Not the kind you roast marshmallows over or warm your hands with on a chilly evening. This was the eternal flame, a symbol, a guardian, and a responsibility that weighed heavily on every young girl who became a Vestal virgin. If you could imagine a single flame carrying the heartbeat of a city, glowing steady through centuries of history, that was it. And the Vestals? They were its caretakers. The flame wasn't just a piece of burning wood. To the Romans, it was Vesta herself, present and watching over the city. As long as the fire burned, Rome thrived. If it went out, people panicked. Even the thought of extinguishing it by accident could send officials running around like they'd forgotten their city was about to vanish in smoke. The flame was Rome's reassurance that the gods were satisfied, or at least not mad enough to start trouble. Tending the flame was not a simple chore. It wasn't just lighting a fire in the morning and calling it a day. Vestals had to check it constantly, feed it with clean wood, remove ashes carefully, and keep it safe from wind, rain, or curious animals. Every gesture was deliberate, measured, and quiet. Mistakes were unthinkable. Imagine babysitting a candle that could ruin a civilization if it flickered out. That was daily life.
The day began early. Before the city roared with merchants and craftsmen, before the Tiber reflected the morning sun, the Vestals would enter the temple, still half asleep, to inspect the flame. They approached it with soft steps, whispered greetings, and a sense of calm reverence. The flame was more than fire. It was a companion, a teacher, and a responsibility that never slept. Rituals surrounded the flame constantly. Water had to be poured carefully into bronze containers, incense was burned, offerings of salt and grain were sprinkled around. Each action was slow and precise, like a choreographed dance. The Vestals moved with the knowledge that centuries of Romans had performed these same movements, and that breaking the rhythm could disturb the balance between gods and city. It wasn't all silent devotion, though. There was community in their duties. The Vestals tended the flame together, sharing stories, guidance, and gentle humor to keep their spirits steady. A joke about an overcooked bread offering or a clumsy assistant knocking over a water jar might float through the temple, not loud enough to disturb the sacred peace, but enough to remind them they were still young women, not statues carved in marble. Sometimes, the duties involved vigilance beyond the temple walls. The Vestals were in charge of keeping certain sacred objects, like the Palladium, a wooden statue that symbolized Rome's safety. They ensured no one took it lightly, no one touched it without ceremony, and that it remained protected as carefully as the flame itself. The weight of responsibility extended beyond one room or one ritual. They were guardians of symbols, traditions, and beliefs that formed the backbone of a city. Their daily lives were a rhythm: check the flame, perform small rituals, sweep ashes, rotate shifts to ensure someone was always watching, and sometimes participate in larger ceremonies. There were meals taken quietly in the house, books or scrolls to study, and occasional visits from priests or officials who brought news or requests for prayers. Every action was layered with significance, though the day often felt meditative. The Vestals moved through it like they were part of the flame's soft glow themselves. The eternal flame also symbolized something personal for each Vestal: discipline. Their daily responsibilities taught focus, patience, and calm in a city that otherwise moved chaotically. It was an exercise in mindfulness centuries before anyone knew what that word meant. The simple act of feeding the flame, watching it flicker and dance, reminded them that life, like the fire, required careful tending. Neglect led to danger. Care led to continuity. On festivals like Vestalia, the flame's importance became visible to the entire city. Citizens brought offerings to the temple, walked quietly, and made wishes or prayers. But even then, the Vestals' interaction with outsiders remained careful. They were protectors, not entertainers. Their flame wasn't part of a show, it was a sacred presence. And during these times, the careful feeding, tending, and observation of the fire became almost ceremonial in front of the people, emphasizing Rome's dependence on their vigilance. There was also a subtle hierarchy in these duties. Younger Vestals learned from older ones. Mistakes were gently corrected, but lessons were firm. If a piece of wood was added wrong, if incense was misplaced, it was noted. Over time, novices became masters. By the end of their 30-year tenure, a Vestal had almost instinctively internalized the rhythm of the flame, the timing of rituals, and the sacred presence that surrounded her life. Interestingly, the eternal flame wasn't always inside a huge temple. Early on, smaller fires represented Vesta in private homes. But as Rome grew, centralizing the flame became a political and spiritual strategy. It was easier to protect one fire than many, and it reinforced the idea that the city itself depended on divine presence. The Vestals became not just caretakers, but symbols of Rome's very survival. Their hands on the flame connected citizens to the gods, quietly reminding everyone that stability started with care and consistency. Even when the Vestals were inside, doing mundane chores like cleaning or studying, the flame's presence was constant. It wasn't background noise. It wasn't decoration. It demanded attention, presence, and respect. Over time, tending it became second nature, a meditation, a lifestyle, a heartbeat synchronized with the city's own. And yet, it wasn't a life without moments of gentle humor or human quirks. One can imagine a Vestal accidentally adding too much incense, coughing softly, glancing nervously at the flame, and then laughing quietly at herself once she realized the smoke wasn't going to anger the goddess. Another might have gently teased a younger Vestal who dropped a wood log, only to remind her later in a soft voice that every gesture counted. Even sacred lives had small human moments. Ultimately, the eternal flame was a teacher, a symbol, and a responsibility all at once. It taught patience, it represented Rome's soul, it demanded vigilance, and it offered a rare kind of calm, steady, unchanging, and eternal in a world of constant flux. Through centuries, the Vestals maintained it, their hands, hearts, and spirits intertwined with the soft glow that kept Rome safe. And that is the quiet, glowing world of the eternal flame, ever burning, ever watched, ever sacred. It was not just fire, it was the pulse of a city. And the Vestals? They were the calm guardians, walking softly around it, feeding it carefully, laughing quietly when needed, and reminding Rome that stability often comes in quiet, steady flames.
Life as a Vestal Virgin wasn't just about quietly feeding a sacred flame. Oh no. There were rituals, festivals, and sacred tasks that filled the rhythm of their days, weeks, and years. And while all of this might sound serious, and it absolutely was, it also had a soft, meditative quality. Imagine a life where everything you do is slow, deliberate, and meaningful. Like yoga, but with more fire and slightly fewer stretchy poses. The Vestal's duties were closely tied to the calendar of Rome, which was filled with religious festivals. These weren't the chaotic street carnivals you might imagine. They were calm, orderly, and symbolic. Each festival reminded the city that the gods were present, watching, and keeping the world in balance. And at the heart of all this, the Vestals played a central role. One of the most important festivals was Vestalia, celebrated in June. During Vestalia, Roman women from all over the city visited the temple of Vesta to offer gifts and prayers. They brought food, flowers, and symbolic objects to honor the goddess of the hearth. The Vestals opened the inner sanctum of the temple, which was normally off-limits, allowing these women a glimpse of the sacred flame. Imagine the quiet footsteps of dozens of women moving respectfully through a sunlit temple, each carrying a small basket of offerings. The air smelled of flowers and incense, soft and calming. During these festivals, the Vestals didn't just stand there. They performed rituals carefully choreographed over centuries, lighting additional ceremonial fires, sprinkling offerings of grain, reciting prayers in measured tones. Even a slight misstep could be noticed. But within their temple, mistakes were gentle lessons rather than panic-inducing disasters. The calm of the ceremony was almost meditative. It reminded the Vestals and the visitors that life required attention, care, and respect. The Vestals also prepared sacred foods used in various ceremonies throughout Rome. Bread was a big one, though not the kind you find at your local bakery. This bread was made with careful precision, sometimes shaped into symbol forms and offered to the goddess or used in state rituals. The process was slow, almost ritualistic in itself. Mixing, kneading, and baking became acts of devotion. You could almost hear the whisper of prayers in each fold of dough. Other sacred tasks included tending holy objects, like the Palladium, a small wooden statue said to protect the city. These artifacts were treated with extreme care, often stored behind locked doors, moved only for important rituals. The Vestals handled these artifacts as if touching them connected them directly to the goddess, reinforcing the quiet power of their role. The Vestals also had to maintain sacred records. Documents related to laws, rituals, and treaties were kept in their temple. Protecting these records wasn't just a bureaucratic duty, it was a spiritual one. The Romans believed that sacred knowledge had to be safeguarded, and the Vestals were trusted with this responsibility.
Their lives were deeply intertwined with the rhythm of both city and ritual. Even in ordinary days, ritual cleanliness played a role. Vestals bathed regularly, wore freshly laundered robes, and kept their temple pristine. Everything they did reflected their devotion. Simple tasks like sweeping the temple floor or arranging flowers became acts of meditation, blending practical work with spiritual purpose. One can imagine a Vestal softly humming a chant while arranging offerings, the morning light warming the marble floor, and a faint scent of incense curling in the air. Sometimes the Vestal's work extended beyond the temple. They attended official ceremonies in the forum, overseeing events, assisting magistrates, and occasionally offering blessings. Their presence alone carried authority. For example, if a Vestal walked into a legal proceeding, her calm, sacred aura could sway judges or at least make everyone speak in a slightly more polite tone. Rome believed that wherever the Vestals went, the presence of Vesta followed. There were also smaller, more frequent rituals, sometimes tied to agriculture. Romans believed that blessings from Vesta ensured fertile crops, healthy livestock, and safe households. Vestals would sprinkle sacred water over fields, present offerings to minor deities, or lead short prayers. Each act was carefully timed and precise. The idea was simple: keep the gods happy, and the city would prosper. It was quiet work, but it mattered enormously. Interestingly, the Vestals had to perform these duties in complete purity. This didn't mean they were isolated from the world forever, but it did mean that their lives followed strict rules. A careless mistake in ritual, a lapse in attention, or improper behavior could carry serious consequences. This pressure might sound intimidating, but for the Vestals, it became a gentle rhythm of life, almost like walking meditation. Each day reinforced calmness, focus, and devotion. In a way, their life was a blend of domesticity and spirituality. They baked, cleaned, arranged, and observed. But all these ordinary acts were elevated by their purpose. Rome was not just running on politics and soldiers. It ran on rituals, care, and quiet devotion. The Vestals were the living embodiment of that principle. Over time, the people of Rome came to see the Vestals not just as priestesses, but as symbols of stability and calm. Their presence at ceremonies reassured citizens that Rome was under divine protection. Their rituals reminded everyone that even in a noisy, chaotic world, there were constants: sacred fires, measured prayers, and gentle hands tending the city's heartbeat. And yes, despite all the rules and seriousness, the Vestals had their small moments of lightheartedness. Perhaps one laughed quietly at a clumsy servant or exchanged a whispered joke while preparing offerings. Life was disciplined, yes, but also human. Even in sacred service, there was room for a little warmth, like sunlight falling across a marble floor. Ultimately, the Vestals' rituals, festivals, and sacred tasks were more than chores or ceremonies. They were the backbone of Rome's spiritual life, the slow, steady rhythm that reminded everyone that devotion and calm could coexist with duty. Each grain of rice, each flicker of incense smoke, each moment spent feeding the flame or arranging offerings contributed to a city's sense of stability and safety. And through all of this, one truth remained: the Vestals' lives were intertwined with the pulse of Rome itself. Their daily work, their careful rituals, and their steady presence reinforced the idea that peace, attention, and devotion were not trivial. They were essential. And for anyone watching this quiet, glowing world from a distance, it must have felt comforting. A reminder that some parts of life, no matter how chaotic, were steady, sacred, and eternal. And so the Vestals moved through their days, slow, deliberate, meditative, careful, sometimes playful, always present. Feeding the flame, offering prayers, tending sacred objects, preparing food, and observing rituals. Each action a small, sacred heartbeat contributing to the eternal rhythm of Rome itself.
Being a Vestal virgin wasn't like going to school for a few hours, then playing in the streets. It was a life structured around discipline, devotion, and the steady rhythm of sacred duties. And yet, even in such a strictly ordered life, There were quiet moments of personal growth, small comforts, and yes, human quirks that made their lives feel a little less like walking statues. A typical day began early, before the noise of Rome reached the temple. Imagine waking up while the city was still half asleep, the streets foggy with morning mist, the air cool and fresh. The Vestals would rise, dress in their simple white robes, and move silently through the hallways of the House of the Vestals, ready to tend the eternal flame. Their movements were deliberate, each gesture practiced and precise. Even brushing the floor, arranging offerings, or opening sacred scrolls was part of the spiritual rhythm. Training started immediately for a young Vestal. In her first decade, she learned the sacred chants, the correct handling of ritual objects, and the precise steps of every ceremony. Mistakes were corrected gently but firmly. Older Vestals acted as teachers and mentors, guiding novices through every nuance. For a child, it might have felt like living in a school where every lesson had eternal consequences, because, in a way, it did. The training wasn't only ceremonial. Vestals learned about sacred history, the myths of Rome, and the traditions that had been passed down for generations. They memorized prayers and chants in a language that sounded familiar but magical at the same time. Each lesson reinforced focus, calmness, and reverence. Their education was holistic, mental, spiritual, and practical. They were learning to embody Vesta herself. After the initial morning duties, a Vestal might spend time in personal study or practice. Scrolls were read, hymns were rehearsed, and sacred objects were inspected. Even cleaning the temple was a kind of practice, a mindful exercise in devotion. Dusting or sweeping wasn't just a chore, it was a way to cultivate attentiveness and respect. In many ways, their daily routine resembled meditation more than work. Meals were quiet, modest, and structured. They often consisted of bread, fruits, cheeses, and occasionally gifts from grateful citizens. Eating was a calm, reflective time. The Vestals were mindful even of their consumption, aware that their purity and discipline extended to every part of life. Conversation was polite and measured, laughter soft and fleeting, never loud enough to disturb the sacred atmosphere. A key aspect of their daily life was rotation around the flame. Someone was always assigned to tend it, day or night. This wasn't boring, it was meditative. Watching the flame flicker and respond to air currents became a lesson in patience, presence, and mindfulness. They learned to recognize subtle changes in the fire, noticing when it needed wood, attention, or gentle encouragement. The flame became a companion, a teacher, and a symbol of the city's stability. Physical training was minimal but purposeful. Vestals didn't march into battle, but they needed stamina for ceremonies, the endurance to stand long hours, and the dexterity to handle ritual tools with care. Their movement was graceful, precise, almost like dancers performing invisible choreography. Posture, poise, and careful gestures were all part of their sacred training. Mentally, the Vestals were also developing resilience. Life in the temple required focus, long-term discipline, and the ability to manage quiet stress. They learned to balance the weight of responsibility with calm composure. Even small errors, spilled incense, misplaced offerings, were opportunities to learn patience. Over time, they developed a kind of inner calm that likely amazed any visitor observing from afar. The Vestals also spent part of their day preparing for public ceremonies. This could involve setting up altars, arranging flowers, preparing offerings, or rehearsing chants. Even though the city outside might have been chaotic and noisy, inside, the temple moved at a deliberate, measured pace. Each movement had significance, and nothing was ever wasted or rushed. Social life within the House of the Vestals was limited, but meaningful. They lived together in small communities, forming bonds that were deeper than friendship, more like sisters connected by shared purpose. They shared advice,
comforted each other during challenging rituals, and celebrated small personal victories quietly. These relationships were essential, providing emotional support in a life otherwise marked by strict rules and devotion. Despite the rigorous routine, there were moments of personal reflection. A Vestal might wander into the courtyard, feel the morning sun on her face, and take a moment to breathe. She could study sacred scrolls, write notes, or quietly admire the statues of former Vestals. Even small acts, like arranging a flower offering just so, became meditative exercises, reinforcing the connection between their inner life and the sacred duties they performed. For a young Vestal, growing into adulthood within the temple was challenging and protective. She left her family early, but in exchange, she gained status, security, and a clear purpose. Her life was structured, yes, but not empty. Every day held meaning, every task carried weight, and every quiet moment contributed to a greater rhythm, the rhythm of Rome itself. Years of training eventually transformed a novice into a fully realized Vestal, capable of performing complex rituals, mentoring younger girls, and managing sacred responsibilities independently. By this point, she had internalized the rituals, the chants, and the discipline. She understood that her life was a bridge between the goddess and the city, and that every action, no matter how small, was part of maintaining Rome's stability. Even the mundane moments, like carrying a basket of grain or sweeping the temple floor, were imbued with sacred significance. Each act, done with attention and care, contributed to the eternal flame's well-being. The Vestals moved through life in a continuous loop of ritual, reflection, and devotion, their personal growth inseparable from their spiritual duties. At night, the temple quieted even further. The Vestals rotated duties, ensuring the flame never went out. Some might sit quietly, reciting chants or observing the fire. Others might rest briefly, knowing that the sacred responsibility continued while they slept. It was a life of vigilance, yes, but also one of profound calm. They were trained to find serenity in focus, meaning in repetition, and joy in quiet dedication. In the end, the life of a Vestal was a careful balance of routine, study, ritual, and reflection. Their daily routine and training shaped them into guardians of Rome's most sacred flame. It was a life of discipline, devotion, and quiet power, a life that demanded respect, patience, and a deep connection to both the goddess Vesta and the city she protected. Through every chore, every ritual, and every quiet moment, the Vestals learned to embody the essence of their goddess: calm, steady, and eternally vigilant. Their lives were a testament to the quiet power of discipline and devotion, and the gentle strength that comes from serving something greater than oneself.
Being a Vestal virgin wasn't just about rules, rituals, and tending a sacred flame. It came with privileges so rare in ancient Rome that most women could only dream about them. And let's be honest, when you dedicate your life to a goddess and the safety of the city, a few perks are kind of deserved. First, Vestals were legally independent. This was extraordinary in a society where women were usually under the control of fathers, husbands, or male relatives. A Vestal could own property, make legal decisions, and even represent herself in court. Imagine a young girl stepping into the temple and realizing she had more personal freedom than most adult women wandering Rome's busy streets. That's a kind of power that could be both comforting and a little intimidating. They also had financial privileges. Vestals received a salary from the state, a steady, reliable income that allowed them to live comfortably within the house of the Vestals. No scrambling for coins, no relying on family wealth, no worrying about sudden poverty. They were completely supported by the city, and in return, they provided spiritual security for Rome. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, the city kept its divine protections, and the Vestals enjoyed stability and comfort. One of the most unusual privileges was freedom from certain laws and punishments. For example, if a Vestal accidentally broke a minor law, the penalty might be reduced or waived entirely. Citizens treated them with extraordinary respect. They could walk through crowds without being jostled, ride in special carriages, and pass through city gates with ceremonial recognition. Essentially, a Vestal's presence commanded quiet reverence, sometimes even without anyone fully understanding why. Their social power was remarkable as well. Vestals could pardon condemned prisoners simply by appearing before them. If a Vestal laid her hand on a person sentenced to death, Roman law often allowed clemency. That's the kind of influence most senators would kill for, except in this case, you couldn't just buy it. You had to be a Vestal. Imagine being a young girl suddenly realizing that a single touch could save someone's life. It's a responsibility and a privilege wrapped together, glowing like the flame they tended. Vestals were also immune to certain societal expectations. Unlike most women, they were not pressured to marry. They didn't have to bear children or manage a household outside the temple. Their entire identity was tied to service, education, and devotion. This might sound restrictive, but for some, it was freeing. They could pursue knowledge, mastery of rituals, and personal growth without being dragged into social dramas or family politics. Even death penalties were handled with ritual care if a Vestal made a mistake. For example, breaking her vow of chastity was considered a grave offense, punishable by burial alive. Sounds terrifying, right? But the Romans had a ritualized way of carrying this out, designed to appease the gods rather than punish out of cruelty. And keep in mind, the risk was extremely rare. Most Vestals were dedicated, disciplined, and careful. Their privileges far outweighed the dangers, as long as they remained faithful to their duties. The Vestal's position also protected them physically. They were legally untouchable in the city. No one could assault or harass them without severe consequences. In a world where women were often vulnerable, this was life-changing. Their sacred status provided safety, and the city had a vested interest in keeping them unharmed. Citizens knew that a Vestal was untouchable, and even rowdy soldiers or politicians would think twice before causing trouble. Ceremonial privileges were just as impressive. Vestals sat in prime positions during games, parades, and religious events. While ordinary citizens crowded the streets, Vestals had front-row seats, elevated recognition, and the city's attention. This wasn't vanity. It was a constant, visible reminder that Rome's spiritual stability rested in their hands. Their presence symbolized order, devotion, and divine favor. Food and gifts were also part of their privileges. Wealthy Romans often gave offerings, hoping for blessings or protection. Vestals received gifts of food, fine clothes, jewelry, and occasionally land. All of this supported their lifestyle and reinforced their importance. Imagine a young girl receiving a basket of delicacies from a grateful citizen. It wasn't just nice, it was proof that the entire city respected and honored her service. The Vestal's house was also a reinforcement of these privileges. It was a private sanctuary, a place where the rules of ordinary society did not fully apply. Within its walls, Vestals enjoyed comfort, security, and freedom from the chaos of the city outside. It was both a home and a symbol of status, with quiet corridors, courtyards, and rooms designed for reflection, study, and ritual. The house itself was a privilege, a daily reminder that they were chosen for something extraordinary. The Vestal's privileges also carried a symbolic weight. Rome itself relied on them not just to tend a flame, but to maintain the spiritual balance of the city. Every right, protection, and honor reflected the city's trust. Vestals were living proof that devotion and discipline brought status, respect, and influence. Their privileges reminded citizens that service to the gods was a form of power, quiet, steady, and eternal.
Even though they were privileged, Vestals weren't entirely free to do whatever they wanted. Their life required constant awareness of their duties. Every privilege came with responsibility, and Rome expected them to behave impeccably. But this was part of the sacred rhythm. Privileges weren't a reward for laziness or whim, they were tools that allowed the Vestals to focus fully on their spiritual and civic mission. In a way, the life of a Vestal balanced extremes. They were immensely powerful, yet strictly controlled, free yet bound by sacred rules, respected yet constantly under observation. This balance created a unique kind of influence, one rooted not in violence, politics, or wealth, but in devotion, ritual, and symbolic authority. They commanded respect naturally, simply by existing in their role and performing their duties with unwavering attention. Ultimately, the privileges and protections of the Vestals weren't just rewards, they were essential tools. They allowed these women to live outside ordinary societal pressures, focus entirely on sacred duties, and maintain the eternal flame without distraction. Privilege in this case wasn't about luxury or status alone, it was about enabling devotion, discipline, and the spiritual security of an entire city. And so the Vestals moved through Rome with grace, quiet authority, and steady purpose. Their privileges weren't merely perks, they were part of the sacred balance. Every action, every gesture, every ceremony performed by these women reinforced the city's belief that the gods were watching, the flame was safe, and Rome itself was under gentle, protective care. In the end, the life of a Vestal combined discipline, devotion, privilege, and protection into a unique existence unlike anything most Romans could even imagine. It was a life of quiet power, measured authority, and profound responsibility. A life built to serve a goddess, a city, and the invisible thread that held both together.
For all their privileges and protections, life as a Vestal Virgin wasn't entirely safe or easy. The role carried weight, responsibility, and yes, some real dangers. Being a Vestal meant walking a delicate line between sacred honor and serious consequences. It was a life of comfort and respect, but also one of constant vigilance, discipline, and awareness of the ever-present rules of the goddess and the city. One of the most obvious dangers was the vow of chastity. Vestals were required to remain pure for their entire 30-year tenure. This wasn't just a moral expectation. It was seen as vital to Rome's survival. The Romans believed that breaking this vow would anger Vesta and put the city at risk. A Vestal who broke her vow faced a terrifying punishment: burial alive in a small underground chamber with minimal food and water. It sounds horrifying, and it was, but the fear of this consequence reinforced discipline and respect for the sacred role. Despite the severity, violations were rare. Vestals were chosen carefully for their character and upbringing, and training reinforced adherence to rules. Yet the pressure could weigh heavily. Even minor lapses in behavior, small rumors, or whispered suspicions could cause stress. Living under the constant gaze of both the goddess and the city required a steady mind, calm nerves, and strong self-control. Another challenge was the risk of ritual mistakes. The sacred flame could not be extinguished. Offering rituals had to be precise. Every ceremony had a correct order, and every gesture carried meaning. A misstep, dropping incense, spilling water, mispronouncing a chant, might not have been life-threatening, but it was serious. Such errors could be interpreted as signs of negligence or weakness, affecting the Vestal's reputation and, in the eyes of some Romans, the safety of the city itself. The long training period was another challenge. Young girls were selected between ages 6 and 10 and trained for at least a decade before they were considered fully responsible. That's a long time to live under structured supervision, away from family, friends, and the freedoms of ordinary childhood. Imagine growing up in a world where every action is watched, every gesture is meaningful, and every step is part of an eternal responsibility. It was disciplined, focused, and occasionally lonely. Isolation was another subtle danger. Although the house of the Vestals was safe and comfortable, it was also a bubble. Vestals had limited contact with the outside world, limited friendships outside their order, and few opportunities for personal expression beyond what their sacred duties allowed. The mental and emotional resilience required to live in such a controlled environment was significant. A young girl had to adapt quickly or risk stress, frustration, or distraction. Even the flame itself carried danger. Tending a fire that could never go out, sometimes for long hours, required physical endurance and attention. Accidents could happen. Sparks could burn robes, flames could flare unexpectedly, or smoke could irritate the eyes. Simple mistakes had potentially serious consequences, not just for the Vestals, but for the symbolic health of Rome itself. Public scrutiny was another challenge. The Vestals were constantly observed by citizens, magistrates, and priests. Their behavior, appearance, and performance of rituals were all noted. A mistake could become gossip, a rumor, or even a political weapon. Their lives were deeply intertwined with the city's perception of order and holiness. Every step outside the house, every public appearance, was a subtle test of composure, calm, and ritual correctness. Additionally, the Vestals had to navigate complex relationships with powerful men. Senators, magistrates, and officials treated them with extreme respect, often bordering on awe. This respect was protective, but could also be intimidating. Any interaction had to be careful, polite, and measured. Misreading social cues could create awkward situations, even in a world structured for their safety. Their freedom was extensive, but their behavior remained under constant moral and social evaluation. Health could be another concern. The Vestals lived in a comfortable, protected environment, but they were human. Long hours of tending the flame, repetitive ritual tasks, and a life of disciplined study could be tiring. They had to maintain their physical stamina, mental focus, and emotional resilience, often without the support systems ordinary families might provide. In essence, they were balancing sacred duties with basic human needs, and any imbalance could cause difficulty. Despite all this, Vestals developed remarkable resilience and strength. They learned to manage fear, remain calm under scrutiny, and take pride in their responsibilities. The dangers and challenges of their life shaped them into figures of extraordinary composure. They became the quiet guardians of Rome, capable of handling pressure, observing ritual precision, and maintaining the city's spiritual heartbeat. Interestingly, some of the dangers were also symbolic. Rome believed that if a Vestal faltered, the city itself could suffer. This created a mental burden, the sense that one's personal behavior directly influenced the fortunes of millions. While modern readers might see this as extreme, for the Vestals it was a powerful motivator, a reminder of the sacred trust placed in them and the significance of their role. Even with challenges, there was a sense of community and support. Older Vestals mentored younger ones, shared wisdom, and helped them navigate difficulties. They laughed quietly, offered gentle guidance, and reminded each other that mistakes could be corrected. And perfection, while ideal, was approached gradually. This support network helped mitigate isolation and stress, creating a shared resilience that made the order strong. In essence, life as a Vestal was a balance between privilege and peril. They enjoyed unprecedented freedom, respect, and status, but these gifts came with extraordinary responsibility. Their safety, spiritual authority, and personal honor depended on discipline, vigilance, and moral integrity. The challenges they faced, ritual precision, vow adherence, public scrutiny, and personal sacrifice, were as integral to their identity as their privileges. Ultimately, the dangers of Vestal life were inseparable from its meaning. The risks reinforced the sacredness of their duties, sharpened their focus, and underscored the importance of every small action. The Vestal's calm, disciplined, and patient approach to life was a direct response to these challenges, creating a unique form of strength that allowed them to protect Rome's flame, traditions, and spiritual heartbeat.
And so, for all their privileges and honors, the Vestals lived with an acute awareness of responsibility, potential peril, and the delicate balance between devotion and danger. It was a life that required courage, wisdom, and a quiet inner strength. A life that few could imagine, but one that left an enduring mark on the history and soul of Rome.
Life as a Vestal Virgin was about much more than tending a sacred flame or performing rituals. Education played a quiet but essential role in shaping these women into the calm, composed, and highly respected figures they became. And unlike most Roman girls, whose learning was limited to household skills and basic literacy, Vestals were trained in both sacred knowledge and practical wisdom. A young girl chosen to become a Vestal started her training around the age of 6 to 10. At first, she learned simple routines, walking quietly through the temple, offering incense, handling objects with care, and understanding basic rituals. These early lessons might seem small, almost mundane, but each was designed to build discipline, focus, and reverence. Every gesture was a step toward mastering a life devoted to Vesta and the city itself. As the years passed, the Vestal's education expanded. They memorized prayers, chants, and sacred texts. Latin was their primary language, but they also became familiar with archaic forms and ceremonial phrases that had been passed down for generations. These words carried immense power. Saying them incorrectly could offend the goddess, or worse, symbolize a lack of care that might worry the city. Learning them wasn't just academic, it was spiritual. Beyond language, Vestals studied ritual knowledge. They learned the precise order of ceremonies, the proper way to arrange offerings, and the correct handling of sacred objects. A Vestal had to know which grains, flowers, or spices were appropriate for each festival, how to prepare ritual bread, and how to present offerings with calm attention. Even the smallest mistakes were considered significant. In a sense, every lesson reinforced mindfulness, awareness of surroundings, careful planning, and deliberate, steady action. They also studied Rome's sacred history and mythology. Stories of gods, goddesses, heroes, and ancestors were not just entertainment. They were lessons in virtue, morality, and civic duty. The Vestals absorbed these tales as models of behavior, examples of divine favor, and cautionary tales of failure. Knowing these stories intimately allowed them to participate fully in public rituals, explain their significance if needed, and embody the wisdom of Rome's spiritual traditions. Education for a Vestal wasn't limited to spiritual matters. They also learned practical skills useful in daily life and temple management. They understood bookkeeping for temple finances, storage of sacred objects, and organization of ceremonies. They could direct servants, oversee preparations, and ensure that everything ran smoothly. In many ways, Vestals were trained as managers, scholars, and spiritual leaders rolled into one. Mentorship played a crucial role in their learning. Older, experienced Vestals guided the younger ones. They corrected mistakes gently, shared stories, and offered advice on handling both sacred duties and social interactions. This mentorship helped novices navigate the pressures of Vestal life and develop the confidence needed to perform rituals flawlessly. It also created a sense of sisterhood, reinforcing the idea that they were part of a supportive, disciplined community. Reading and writing were essential skills. Vestals needed to read sacred scrolls, record ceremonies, and understand instructions from priests or magistrates. They also wrote notes, kept track of offerings, and occasionally composed prayers or chants. Literacy gave them autonomy, enabling them to operate independently and maintain the sacred traditions without relying entirely on oral instruction. Physical education, though less emphasized than mental and spiritual training, also played a role. Vestals practiced careful movements, graceful walking, and posture control. Their gestures during rituals needed to be precise and fluid, so training included exercises to maintain poise and coordination. Even simple motions like lifting an offering or bowing in the correct manner were rehearsed, ensuring that ceremonies were both beautiful and meaningful. Education wasn't all work, though. There were moments of quiet reflection, discussion, and even gentle humor. Young Vestals might practice chants together, laugh softly at minor mistakes, or share observations about the day. These small, human moments created a balance in a life otherwise dominated by ritual and responsibility. Learning was serious, yes, but also part of a community experience that offered companionship and subtle joy. One fascinating aspect of Vestal learning was oral tradition. Certain chants, prayers, and rituals were never written down fully. They were passed from Vestal to Vestal, generation to generation. Memorizing these required concentration, repetition, and discipline. The process itself became a form of meditation. Reciting a chant correctly wasn't just a skill, it was an act of devotion. It linked the individual to centuries of women who had performed the same rites. The culmination of education for a Vestal was full mastery of both ritual and knowledge. By the time she completed her 30-year service, a Vestal could perform any ceremony flawlessly, mentor new novices, and act as a guardian of Rome's spiritual and civic order. Her education had shaped her into a figure of calm authority, a woman whose presence reassured citizens, priests, and magistrates alike. Interestingly, Vestal education also fostered a unique form of empowerment. In a society where women were often limited to domestic roles, Vestals had intellectual authority, spiritual responsibility, and social influence. Their learning allowed them to navigate the complexities of Rome's religious and civic life with confidence. They were scholars, ritual experts, and respected figures, a combination few women outside the temple could achieve. Through decades of structured training, study, and practice, Vestals developed a sense of calm resilience. They learned patience, focus, and meticulous attention to detail. These qualities were essential not just for ritual success, but for surviving the pressures and expectations of their sacred role. Education became a tool for both personal growth and public service. Ultimately, the education of a Vestal virgin was a lifelong journey. It was rigorous, disciplined, and carefully structured, but it was also rich with purpose, meaning, and quiet satisfaction. Every lesson, every ritual, every chant reinforced the idea that knowledge, devotion, and calm attention were inseparable. By the time a Vestal reached maturity, she had not only mastered sacred duties, but also cultivated a mind and spirit shaped by centuries of tradition, wisdom, and disciplined learning. And so the education of the Vestals was not just about learning, it was about becoming. Becoming calm, disciplined, knowledgeable, and devoted. Becoming a living embodiment of Rome's spiritual heart. Becoming the quiet guardians of the eternal flame, the city's sacred history, and the delicate balance between divine favor and mortal responsibility.
While Vestal virgins lived largely within the sacred walls of their temple, their lives were far from disconnected from the bustling, chaotic world of Roman politics. In fact, their position placed them at a subtle yet powerful intersection between religion and governance. They didn't debate laws in the forum or campaign for office, but their presence and actions influenced the city's leaders and even affected political outcomes. Romans believed that the favor of the gods was essential for the city's stability. Since the Vestals were considered the primary mediators between Vesta and Rome, their role carried tremendous weight. Magistrates, senators, and even emperors knew that honoring the Vestals, following protocol, and respecting rituals was not just etiquette, it was politically necessary. Offending a Vestal, even unintentionally, could be disastrous. Imagine attending a Senate meeting and realizing you've accidentally insulted a divine guardian. Panic would be mild compared to what might follow. The Vestal's influence was often quiet, indirect, but undeniable. Their attendance at public ceremonies or festivals lent legitimacy to political events. A new law, treaty, or public announcement accompanied by the presence of Vestals signaled divine approval.
Citizens and officials alike interpreted their calm, composed presence as a sign that the gods were watching favorably. Essentially, they acted as spiritual arbiters, quietly endorsing, or at least not opposing, political actions. Even more directly, Vestals could intervene in legal matters. They had the power to pardon condemned prisoners simply by touching them. In one sense, this was a moral and religious act, but in another, it was inherently political. Pardoning a high-profile criminal or appearing to do so could affect public opinion, sway factions, and send subtle messages to powerful leaders. Their authority wasn't wielded through speeches or armies, but through symbolic actions that carried real consequences. Vestals were also involved in rituals that safeguarded the city, rituals that had political significance. During crises like famine, plague, or war, Vestals performed ceremonies meant to restore divine favor. Their rituals reassured citizens and leaders that the gods still watched over Rome. When the Vestals tended the eternal flame, prepared offerings, or conducted sacred rites, they weren't just performing religious duties, they were stabilizing the city in a way that had tangible political effects. Calm, silent devotion became a tool of governance. Interestingly, their influence sometimes extended to family and social connections. Powerful Roman families often sought Vestal's favor, hoping for blessings or subtle support. A Vestal's calm approval could smooth tensions, bless alliances, or signal legitimacy. Though they were sworn to neutrality in politics, their sacred authority made them inherently political figures. Leaders and citizens alike understood that the Vestal's favor, or perceived favor, could shape outcomes behind the scenes. The Vestal's political power was symbolic. They represented the continuity and stability of Rome itself. No matter who held office, whether the city was at war or at peace, the presence of Vestals performing timeless rituals reassured citizens that divine protection endured. Politicians leaned on this symbolism, understanding that associating themselves with Vestals was a way to gain credibility. In essence, Vestals acted as spiritual anchors in Rome's turbulent political seas. At times, the Vestals became part of political intrigue, whether they wanted to or not. Their sacred status and influence made them visible to ambitious leaders, and their endorsement, direct or indirect, was coveted. While they rarely engaged in manipulation themselves, their rituals and presence could be interpreted as support for one faction or another. A calm, deliberate gesture could carry far-reaching consequences. It was a delicate balance, remain faithful to sacred duty while navigating the subtle currents of politics. The Vestal's independence was key to this influence. Unlike ordinary women, they were legally untouchable, could own property, and were free from the control of male relatives. This autonomy made them not only respected, but also somewhat untouchable in political negotiations. No senator could coerce them easily, and their decisions in ritual matters were final. This combination of autonomy and sacred authority gave Vestals an unusual kind of indirect political clout. Yet they were careful. The Vestals had to maintain neutrality, never openly favoring one politician or faction over another. Their power was derived from respect, sacred duty, and the city's perception of divine approval. Crossing this line could undermine their authority, anger the gods, and even put the city at risk. They walked a fine line between spiritual leadership and political visibility, always aware that subtle actions could ripple outward in unexpected ways. One striking example of their political role was their involvement in triumphs and public processions. When generals returned victorious from campaigns, Vestals often participated in ceremonies that blessed the army and legitimized the triumph. Their calm presence reassured citizens that the victory had divine favor.
Their participation wasn't a personal endorsement, but a symbolic assurance that Rome itself had been protected by the gods. Through gestures, prayers, and ritual movements, Vestals subtly influenced both public sentiment and political narratives. Even in times of crisis, the Vestal's role was vital. Fires, plagues, or invasions required the city to show unity and faith. The Vestal's rituals, offerings, and careful tending of sacred spaces reassured citizens and leaders alike that Rome was under divine protection, helping to maintain order during potentially chaotic moments. Spiritual stability became a kind of social and political stability as well. Ultimately, the Vestal's involvement in politics was quiet but essential. They didn't wield swords, write laws, or campaign for office. They influenced the city through ritual, symbolism, and calm authority. Every action, lighting the eternal flame, preparing offerings, blessing a procession, was imbued with significance. Citizens and leaders alike understood that the Vestals were a living link between Rome and the sacred, a bridge connecting sacred duty with civic stability. In the end, the Vestals' political role was subtle, powerful, and enduring. They were silent influencers, guardians of tradition, and symbols of divine favor. By performing their rituals with calm precision, maintaining discipline, and embodying spiritual authority, they shaped the social and political fabric of Rome. Even the most ambitious senators or magistrates knew that the Vestal's approval, implicit or visible, was a force to respect. And so, while the Vestals rarely spoke in the political arena, their presence, actions, and rituals spoke volumes. They reminded the city, leaders, and citizens alike that divine favor, discipline, and calm vigilance were inseparable from the health and stability of Rome. In a city defined by power struggles, wars, and shifting alliances, the Vestals remained a quiet, constant force, an enduring symbol of the sacred, the stable, and the eternal.
For most Vestal virgins, life was defined by the 3 decades they spent tending the sacred flame, performing rituals, and embodying the calm authority of Vesta. But what happened after their service ended? After 30 years, when the flame they had guarded so carefully no longer needed their constant attention, their lives took a new, quieter turn. The transition was significant, filled with both relief and opportunity, yet it carried its own challenges. First, it's important to understand that becoming a Vestal was not just a temporary role, it was a life-defining commitment. 30 years is a long time. For a girl chosen at age 6 or 10, she would be in her mid-30s by the time her service ended. This is a moment in life when most Roman women were already married and raising families. Vestals, however, had spent decades in structured devotion, protected from marriage and social expectations. Suddenly, the world outside the temple could feel both inviting and overwhelming. Upon completing her service, a Vestal was granted freedom and a pension. She could live independently, own property, and make her own legal decisions, privileges few Roman women enjoyed. Many chose to remain in Rome, building comfortable lives supported by the respect and resources earned through their decades of service. Their knowledge, experience, and status gave them authority in both spiritual and social matters, and citizens often continued to seek their guidance in religious affairs. Some former Vestals married, though not all did. For those who chose to wed, their previous status as a Vestal carried immense prestige. Marrying a former Vestal was a mark of distinction. Their husbands gained not just a wife, but a woman respected by the gods and the city alike. The union was a careful negotiation of social expectations, blending domestic life with the spiritual legacy of the Vestal's sacred years. Other former Vestals preferred a quieter life. They might continue advising on rituals, mentoring new Vestals, or managing religious property. Their expertise in sacred knowledge and ceremonies was invaluable. Even though they were no longer actively tending the flame, they retained spiritual authority, respect, and influence.
In essence, their roles shifted from active service to elder guidance, like a sage who has walked the path and now quietly leads others. Interestingly, life after service was not without social pressures. A former Vestal had spent her entire adult life apart from ordinary society. She had missed childhood games, marriage, and family life while focusing on discipline and devotion. Returning to the social world required adjustment. She had to navigate relationships, interact with citizens, and reintegrate into a city that had moved on during her decades in the temple. The transition could be delicate, but the respect she commanded often eased the process. Former Vestals were also valued for their ritual knowledge. Even after leaving full service, they were often consulted for advice, interpretation of sacred texts, or guidance in ceremonies. Their experience allowed them to correct mistakes, train novices, and ensure continuity of tradition. The city relied on them as living libraries of religious wisdom. In this way, their influence quietly persisted, long after the flame was no longer theirs to tend. In some cases, former Vestals became symbols of moral and spiritual authority. Citizens admired their discipline, respect for tradition, and unwavering devotion. Their mere presence could calm crowds, reassure magistrates, or lend legitimacy to events. Former Vestals had the rare combination of social influence, spiritual prestige, and personal freedom, an enviable position in a society where women often had limited roles. Health and well-being also became priorities. After decades of rigorous routine, meditation, and disciplined work, former Vestals could finally rest more fully. They could focus on personal care, enjoy leisurely walks, and indulge in the quiet pleasures of life previously restricted by ritual schedules. They could read, write, and reflect without the constant pressure of ceremonial precision. For many, these years were a well-earned period of peace and calm. Yet, even in retirement, the sacred shadow of their past lingered. Vestals were forever associated with Vesta, the eternal flame, and Rome itself. Citizens continued to approach them for blessings, guidance, and advice. Their actions, words, and presence still carried meaning. Former Vestals had to balance their newfound freedom with the lingering expectations of a society that revered their past service. Even in retirement, a Vestal's life was quietly significant. Some former Vestals chose to write or document their experiences. They recorded rituals, hymns, and observations of the sacred life they had led. These writings became valuable for historians, scholars, and future Vestals. By sharing their knowledge, they contributed to the continuity of Rome's religious traditions. In a sense, retirement allowed them to step back and reflect, transforming practical experience into lasting legacy. The transition also allowed for personal reflection. After decades of structured devotion, former Vestals had time to contemplate the meaning of their service, the lessons they had learned, and the patterns of life they had observed. They had spent their adult years embodying calm, discipline, and attention. Now they could apply those lessons to personal growth, relationships, and spiritual insight outside the temple. Interestingly, the legacy of former Vestals often extended into their families and communities. Their experience and status could elevate relatives, guide neighbors, or influence local religious practices. A former Vestal's quiet authority often reached far beyond the temple walls, shaping social and spiritual life throughout Rome. Their influence endured in subtle but meaningful ways. In the end, life after service was both a reward and a new beginning. Former Vestals had completed a sacred mission, earning privileges, respect, and spiritual authority. They could enjoy personal freedom while retaining the prestige and influence of their past. They became symbols of wisdom, calm, and continuity, living reminders of the sacred flame they had once guarded so faithfully.
The Vestal Virgins were not only guardians of the eternal flame, but also central figures in the rhythm of Roman public life. Their presence at festivals, processions, and public ceremonies made them living symbols of Rome's sacred traditions. Watching a Vestal move gracefully through the streets, performing ritual gestures with calm precision, was like seeing the city's heartbeat made visible. They didn't march with armies or sit in the Senate, but their influence was woven into every significant civic and religious event. Festivals were the lifeblood of Roman culture, combining entertainment, spirituality, and social gathering. For Vestals, these events were both duties and opportunities to display the discipline, grace, and authority they embodied. During ceremonies like the Vestal Festival, they prepared offerings, recited prayers, and participated in processions. Their movements were deliberate and ceremonial, a living choreography connecting the city to the divine. Citizens understood that these women were not simply participants, they were protectors of Rome's sacred order. One of the most striking aspects of Vestals in public life was their visibility and recognition. During processions, they often walked in front of magistrates or alongside priests, drawing the gaze of crowds. Their white robes, calm demeanor, and composed expressions set them apart from the hustle and noise of the city. Even from a distance, it was clear these were women with a sacred purpose, a presence both commanding and serene. During religious festivals, Vestals played key roles in offering rituals and sacrifices. They prepared ceremonial bread, arranged sacred herbs, and tended the eternal flame at altars outside the temple. Each action had layers of meaning. A simple gesture, lifting an offering, pouring water, or lighting incense, was a sign that Rome was aligned with divine favor. Citizens believed that the success of the festival, and, by extension, the city's fortune, depended on the Vestals performing these duties correctly. Some festivals required the Vestals to be visible symbols of purity and calm authority. For example, during the Perilia, a festival celebrating Rome's founding and rural traditions, Vestals performed rites to purify the city. Their presence reassured citizens that both the past and present were aligned with the gods. This role was deeply symbolic. Vestals were not just participants. They were living embodiments of Rome's continuity, stability, and divine protection. Interestingly, Vestals also played a part in bridging social hierarchies. They interacted with ordinary citizens, nobles, and magistrates alike, but in a manner that maintained both respect and neutrality. Their calm demeanor reminded people that divine authority was above politics and social status. A Vestal walking quietly through a crowded forum could command more attention than the loudest senator, simply by embodying sacred presence. Some public events were even dangerous, at least symbolically. Fires, plagues, or military threats might prompt rituals performed by Vestals to appease the gods. They acted as intermediaries, calming fears and reminding citizens that the divine was watching. Their rituals often included elaborate ceremonies that combined prayer, offerings, and symbolic gestures meant to restore balance. These moments required focus and composure, as mistakes could be seen as signs of divine displeasure. The Vestal's participation in public life also had a psychological impact. Citizens observing their calm, disciplined presence felt reassurance and order. In a city filled with chaos, political intrigue, and occasional violence, Vestals were anchors. They reminded the population that the gods were still present, the sacred flames still burned, and Rome remained under divine care. In this sense, their influence was as much about emotional and social stability as it was about ritual correctness. During triumphs, when generals returned victorious from war, Vestals performed blessings and participated in processions. Their presence validated the victory in a spiritual sense, signaling that Rome had divine approval. The same principle applied to dedications of temples, inaugurations of magistrates, or public games. A Vestal's calm, precise participation lent authority and sacred legitimacy to events that might otherwise feel purely political or ceremonial. Festivals and public life also provided moments of connection and mentorship among Vestals. Younger Vestals learned by observing their elders during complex ceremonies, noting the rhythm of gestures, the tone of chants, and the subtleties of ritual timing.
Every public appearance was both a teaching opportunity and a test of composure. Even in the bustle of the city, Vestals maintained a quiet, deliberate presence that conveyed both grace and authority. Their visibility in public life carried social responsibility as well. Citizens watched closely, and the Vestal's behavior could influence public opinion. Their calm, disciplined actions became a model for proper conduct, reinforcing societal norms. By performing rituals flawlessly, they reminded people of the importance of tradition, respect, and reverence. In this way, Vestals acted as moral and spiritual guides, shaping behavior through example rather than direct instruction. Interestingly, even in moments of celebration, Vestals maintained restraint and poise. While citizens might cheer, laugh, and feast, Vestals moved with measured calm, a reminder that devotion and discipline remained central to their identity. Their presence subtly balanced joy with reverence, grounding the festivities in spiritual awareness. It was a quiet form of leadership, demonstrating that influence could be exercised without words or force. In essence, Vestals in Roman festivals and public life were both participants and symbols. They performed essential rituals, guided citizens spiritually, and reinforced the city's social and moral fabric. Their calm authority, disciplined presence, and ritual precision made them indispensable to Rome's public life. Citizens relied on them not only to perform ceremonies correctly, but also to provide a sense of continuity, stability, and divine favor. And so, the Vestal's role in public life extended far beyond the temple walls. Whether leading rituals, blessing citizens, or walking gracefully in processions, they remained a constant, calming force in the city. Their presence reminded Rome that even amidst chaos, politics, and human unpredictability, there were women devoted to order, sacred duty, and the steady care of the gods. In the hum of the crowd, the clatter of games, and the echo of cheers, the calm rhythm of the Vestal's life could still be felt, a quiet heartbeat beneath the life of Rome itself.
After centuries of service, discipline, and devotion, the Vestal Virgins left a legacy that reached far beyond the temple walls. Their lives were intertwined with the spiritual, social, and political heartbeat of Rome, shaping the city in ways both subtle and profound. Though the eternal flame they tended may no longer burn today, the story of the Vestals continues to captivate, inspire, and teach us about devotion, resilience, and quiet influence. The most obvious legacy of the Vestals is their religious significance. For centuries, they embodied the sacred presence of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home, in a city that valued divine protection above all else. By maintaining the eternal flame, performing rituals, and guiding the spiritual life of Rome, they became living symbols of stability and devotion. Citizens looked to them as the embodiment of sacred order, a constant reminder that the gods were watching, protecting, and guiding the city. Their influence extended beyond religion into social and cultural life. Vestals were admired for their discipline, grace, and composure. They moved through Rome as figures of calm authority, offering an example of serenity in a bustling, often chaotic city. Their very presence reinforced social norms, respect for tradition, attention to ritual, and mindfulness in behavior. Even those who never entered the temple understood the importance of the Vestal's role and the quiet power they wielded. In addition, Vestals left a legacy of female empowerment, though not in the modern sense, certainly in a context far ahead of their time. They were legally independent, could own property, and exercised influence in both religious and civic matters. They were educated, disciplined, and respected. For a society where women's roles were typically limited to domestic duties, Vestals demonstrated that devotion and discipline could translate into real authority and societal impact. Their lives showed that women could hold power, not through force, but through knowledge, presence, and sacred responsibility. The Vestal story is also a lesson in balance and discipline.
Their lives were highly structured, but within that structure was a profound sense of purpose and freedom. They learned to combine ritual, study, and reflection, navigating challenges while maintaining calm and grace. This balance, cultivated over decades, created a kind of inner strength that shaped both the individual Vestals and the city they served. It's a reminder that discipline, when paired with devotion, can create a lasting impact far beyond immediate actions. Their influence on Roman politics and public life remains an important part of their legacy. Though they did not wield swords, pass laws, or campaign for office, their presence in ceremonies, festivals, and public rituals subtly shaped the city's governance and social order. By lending spiritual legitimacy to events, offering blessings, and performing rituals with calm authority, they influenced leaders and citizens alike. They demonstrated that quiet, deliberate action could wield immense influence, a lesson as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The Vestals also left an enduring historical and cultural record. Through the writings of historians, the remnants of their temple, and the traditions preserved in Roman texts, we have glimpses of their lives, rituals, and society. These records allow modern readers to understand the importance of religion, ritual, and social structure in ancient Rome. They show that devotion, education, and discipline were deeply intertwined with civic life, creating a legacy that continues to fascinate scholars and enthusiasts alike. Even the concept of personal sacrifice is central to their legacy. Vestals gave decades of their lives to a sacred mission, forgoing marriage, children, and ordinary freedoms. They did so willingly, guided by training, devotion, and a sense of purpose. Their sacrifices were profound, yet they also highlight a quiet strength, the ability to dedicate oneself fully to a higher calling. This lesson resonates across time, reminding us that commitment and responsibility, even when demanding, can leave an enduring mark. Another remarkable aspect of their legacy is the community and mentorship they cultivated. Experienced Vestals guided novices, ensuring continuity of knowledge, ritual precision, and moral guidance. This tradition of mentorship ensured that each generation could build upon the last, preserving sacred practices while fostering calm, disciplined individuals. The importance of passing knowledge quietly, with patience and care, is a lesson that extends far beyond the temple, applicable to families, schools, and societies today. The Vestal's story also reminds us of the symbolic power of women in history. Though limited by societal norms, their spiritual authority allowed them to shape the city and influence leaders, demonstrating that influence can take many forms. They were not warriors, rulers, or politicians, yet their lives mattered deeply. They shaped hearts, minds, and the very foundation of Rome's spiritual and social life. Their legacy proves that influence often comes from dedication, presence, and the quiet performance of duty. Even today, the Vestals inspire fascination and respect. Their discipline, courage, and calm authority continue to capture imaginations. Museums, books, and documentaries celebrate their lives, allowing us to reflect on the unique combination of devotion, power, and responsibility that define them. Their story encourages reflection on our own lives, how we balance duty with freedom, discipline with personal growth, and public responsibility with private reflection. Ultimately, the Vestal's legacy is one of enduring presence and calm influence. They remind us that even in a world filled with chaos, power struggles, and change, quiet dedication can have lasting effects. Their lives were a bridge between the divine and the human, the sacred and the civic, the past and the future. They taught Rome, and now the world, that devotion, discipline, and calm attention are forces more enduring than armies, wealth, or political power. The eternal flame they tended may have faded in history, but the ideals they embodied, faithfulness, serenity, discipline, and influence through presence continued to shine. Each Vestal, with her careful rituals, measured movements, and unwavering focus, contributed to a legacy that shaped a city, inspired generations, and left a story we can still learn from today. In the end, the Vestals were more than guardians of a flame. They were guardians of values, of knowledge, and of a sense of calm authority that allowed Rome to thrive. Their lives remind us that true power often lies in service, patience, and the quiet performance of one's duties. And though centuries have passed, the story of the Vestal Virgins remains a gentle, enduring echo of devotion, discipline, and the sacred heartbeat of ancient Rome.